Good morning. I'm Cody Judy, running for U.S. Senate in 2018. Step up, Utah. Don't step down. Write my name in. Cody Judy, U.S. Senate, Utah. Provided kind of like a little picture guide of how to write a candidate in who you don't see on the ballot. If I was to title this video, I'd probably title it, "Don't Be Stupid, Woman." Probably a lot of women take that offensively. A strong woman votes. I see so much of the women who are single, feeling vulnerable, and they post things like, "I am a strong woman. I am independent." Blah, blah, blah. Well, I'll start off on a positive note here. And I'll read Proverbs. One of my very favorite scriptures, actually, is in Proverbs chapter 31. And it's about women. It's about wise women. Women who aren't stupid. Women who understand that a strong constitution is most important for them. You know, it wasn't until 4 months before I was born, I think it was August 1965, that Voting Act right was passed that made women full citizens. And with that comes a responsibility not to be stupid. And I'm going to read an article to you pointing out how stupid women voted in 2008 and 2012, and how there's about 53% of women that vote, so they basically decide the presidential election. And you know, it's kind of a frustrating thing. I mean, I'm a psychology major, and so I've studied quite a bit between the gender differences, and the primary emphasis on women and men, and the primitive or natural inherent tendencies. And you know, for women, the most important thing, quite naturally, is protection, and she's got a great nurturing quality. And I would say a short-term vision. Now, I'm not saying all women, I'm just saying generally speaking, with the laws of nature combined, the differences between men and women, And if you're going to be strong women and be intelligent, responsible, and accountable citizen, you've got to incorporate those qualities that you have, but you've also got to consider a long-term vision and what actually made you citizens, a strong Constitution of the United States of America. And when you vote against a strong Constitution of the United States of America, you're basically voting to be subjects, and not to be citizens anymore. You're basically eating your own voting rights. You're eating your own citizenship. And the Lord will come out and correct whom He will. And the Lord established the Constitution in this land of the United States of America. Today is October 29th. And 29, 30, 31, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We got about 8 days before the election. So, women, this is kind of dedicated to you. Starting in Proverbs chapter 31, in verse I want to start in verse 8, chapter 31 of Proverbs, reading the Holy Bible. Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Correct your stupidness. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. I've elaborated much on how women today are basically with their envy, with their pride, with their haughtiness, oppressing the poor and the needy. Their covetousness and their greed, their love of money, and their lack of appreciation for principle. In verse 10 we read, "Who can find a virtuous woman?" I'm not talking just on the sexual level. I'm talking about wisdom and understanding. Virtue is an all-encapsulating adjective. Virtuous, pure. Virtuous also means intelligent. Virtuous also means wise. Virtuous means moral. And morality encompasses the opposite of everything I just said as far as greed and sin and pride and envy and covetousness and oppression upon the poor and needy. So do all those who would call themselves daughters of God, daughters of the Creator mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, daughters of the Lord mentioned in the year of our Lord that our Constitution was signed. What Lord? Our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he hath he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant ship, she bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household and a portion of her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it with the fruit of her hands. She planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor. Yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen, and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing. Strength and honor are her clothing. And she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Let her own works, her own voting record. Her own voting record that affects her future generations, her children. This is an article I'm going to read. It's called The Woman's Vote, Women's Suffrage, subtitle. The first gathering devoted to women's rights in the United States was in 1848. In Seneca Falls, New York, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a mother of 4 from upstate New York, and Lucretia Mott, a Quaker abolitionist, can't say that word, abolitionist, were the principal organizers of what came to be known as the Seneca Falls Convention. Stanton took a page from the Founding Fathers' playbook, drafting a declaration of sentiments, grievances, and resolutions that echoed the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. It still took many years of lobbying, but finally on January 10th, 1918, the House of Representatives passed an initial voting rights amendment. It was over 2 more years until the 19th Amendment passed on August 26, 1920, providing full voting rights for white women nationally, a full 72 years after Seneca Falls. Voting Rights Act of 1965, Women Equality Day, celebrates the historic day in 1920 when white women were granted the right to vote. It actually wasn't until 4.5 decades later, on August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, that all women in the United States were able to cast a ballot as full citizens. Of course, some states were more progressive than others in recognizing suffrage as the basic human right. In other words, voting. But it is important to remember how recent that history really how recent this history really is. Next year will mark the 50-year anniversary of when every American in 50 states could legally vote, an important milestone in the history of our country. What is the gender gap in voting? Subtitle: The gender gap in voting is the difference between the percentage of women and the percentage of men voting for a given candidate. In every presidential election since 1980, there has been a gender gap, with a greater proportion of women than men preferring the Democrat in each case. A gender gap was evident in the 2012 presidential election, with women favoring Barack Obama by 10 percentage points over Mitt Romney. The gender gap widened considerably in 2012 with Latinos and African Americans, but also with whites. President Obama's gender gap among whites grew and was larger than the gender gap among whites in the last 4 midterm elections. Women are clearly a powerful voting bloc and decide elections. And when women turn out to vote in even higher numbers, even more reason to get women on the ballot. The gender gap shows that women voters matter both as voters and leaders. Perspective on the power of the women's vote. Subtitle: Women make the difference. According to exit polls, 53% of voters in 2012 election were women, which means that women determine the outcome of the presidential election. Diane Bystrom, the director of Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State, says, "The reason the gender gap is critical is that more women are registered to vote than men in most states, and there is much higher female turnout rate at the polls. In the 2008 election, 10 million more women than men voted. The equation is simple. More female voters equals more female power, especially in battleground states where women outvote men in the hundreds of thousands. With women deciding the presidential election and with record numbers of women in both the House and the Senate, America's policies will look very different in the next decade than it did in the last. Women determine the outcome of the way the government looks, and new economic fairness, pay equity, and issues of work-family balance are making their way to the top of the policy agenda." End of article. So we read from that article that women basically decided the 2008 and 2012 elections voting for a candidate who was not even a natural-born citizen. Natural-born citizen is born in the U.S. to citizen parents. All the other contingencies of citizenship are equated in a naturalization act or determined by law of men. If you look up naturalization qualification, you'll find a lot of different attributes of quote-unquote citizen. Not natural-born citizen. Citizen. And that'll include like someone who is born in the United States to foreign parents, qualified under the 14th Amendment as a citizen, born in the U.S. or one of the states of the Union. And you look up the Naturalization Acts of Congress, or qualifications of naturalization, you'll find other things like born in a foreign country to one citizen parent. So if you're born in a different country, but you had one citizen parent of the U.S., for example, one U.S. citizen who was your mother, or one U.S. citizen who was your father, then you qualify as a U.S. citizen under a particular naturalization or adoption. Now, in the Constitution, you'll see that the qualifications to be a U.S. Senator or a U.S. House of Representative is citizen, quote unquote citizen. So the United States gives great leniency and encouragement for those who are first generation citizens of the United States of America. And that qualification is pretty lenient. Just being born in the United States or having a U.S. citizen parent, one parent, gives you the right as an American citizen to be and run for the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate. The office of President was the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The stipulation was higher, and it was actually very clearly outlined in a natural-born citizen or someone who's born in the U.S. to U.S. citizen parents. That's a generation gap, 2-generation qualification, and represents an acclimation period. Congress considered in 2000, the House Judiciary Committee, many testimonies were given acknowledging that there needed to be an acclimation period. That was important because it weeded out more of the foreign influences and discriminations and inequalities and biases and preferences being acclimated under the United States of the Constitution for 2 generations, both in nature or nurturing and in the natural law or soil, place and parents, which are the 2 factors that make up all of the parameters of citizenship and natural-born citizenship. Now, understanding that a strong constitution is necessary to maintain equality of rights, you understand how stupid it was for women who determined the 2008 and 2012 elections to vote for someone who was not even a natural-born citizen qualified under the Constitution. Now, if you don't think that's stupid, and if you don't think that that vote was a vote against even your own children's future, then you're beyond being able to have a rational discussion. Because under Barack Obama, your child was basically sold. Every man, woman, and child was sold for $70,000 in a $10 trillion debt. And you don't think that that's important for your children because you voted for someone who was not even qualified under the Constitution of the United States. Now, the good Lord, when you act in evil or corruptive ways, He will let you go out like you're hooked in a fish on a run that's got a hook in his mouth. And he thinks he's still free, and he thinks he still has liberty, and he's swimming away from the fisherman who's got the hold of the pole, and he's got that hook in his mouth. And then, all of a sudden, the line runs out. And what happens to that fish with the hook in the mouth when the line runs out? All of a sudden, he realizes he is not free and he doesn't have liberty. And it happens that quick. Now, you could basically say that there's an argument that would say women wised up and voted for President Donald Trump in 2016. Well, if that was entirely true, then President Donald Trump would have immediately signed a protection for the office of the president, in stipulating, rather than go through all of the money that it has cost, not only for the special prosecutor in Robert Mueller's case, director that Obama came in under, and CIA Director Brennan, who also, just by chance, if you think that, was the president of a corporation down in Arizona before he was made the CIA director. The president of that corporation, the same corporation where it was discovered that a breach was made in the passports of Senator Barack Obama, Senator Hillary Clinton, and Senator John McCain. Now, John McCain had 2 acts of Congress on his citizenship, which means he was naturalized both to be a citizen and stipulated by half of Congress in Senate Resolution 511 to be a natural-born citizen. It's the first act of Congress stipulating a natural-born citizen, which is an oxymoron. I don't need 2 acts of Congress telling me that I'm a citizen or a natural-born citizen. I was born in the U.S. to citizen parents. Unequivocally, without a doubt, in everyone's mind, I am a natural-born citizen. There is no court in the land which would even question someone who's born in the U.S. to U.S. citizen parents, that they are a natural-born citizen. Now, in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 of the Constitution, in the Office of the President qualifications, where those are housed, it stipulates natural-born citizen, and then it stipulates a difference between natural-born citizen and citizen, or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Now, the adoption of the Constitution came in and was a new lawful jurisdiction. And everybody who wasn't under that lawful jurisdiction of the U.S. Constitution before, they weren't natural-born citizens either, which required a grandfather clause adopting them in. So a adoption clause was considered, basically proving that natural-born citizen was not a citizen per se. There was a difference. Let me say it that way. There was a difference. Natural-born citizen would be the propagation of citizens, U.S. citizens, their children. So there was a 2-generation wall set up right there from the beginning. But the founding fathers recognized that under this new jurisdiction of law called the U.S. Constitution, that they were not natural-born citizens of this new jurisdiction, the Constitution of the United States of America. Their children could be those natural-born citizens of the new jurisdiction. But they, in the adoption of the new law, were simply citizens. So there was a 2-generation gap, and the gap in natural-born citizen and quote-unquote citizen was understood to be wise and seasonable because it prevented foreign leaders from betting an American woman and financing their heir to the office of the president, taking over the American army. Now, they must have counted on people being stupid to that intelligence and wisdom, because they also stipulated another reign, which was the only reign the only constitutional reign that kept Barack Obama out of the office of the president a third time, and that was the 2-term limit. Basically, it didn't prevent Barack Obama from selling every single American man, woman, and child for $70,000 in 8 years. And we just read an article stipulating that women were the reason that he got in office. The immoral reason, because they weren't virtuous in understanding the Constitution of the United States of America. I was a presidential candidate in 2008, 2012, and 2016, standing up against both Senator John McCain and Senator Barack Obama. The media wouldn't cover those very high-profile cases in the jurisdiction of the judicial branch. And believe me, reporters have news feeds and are privy to every case that comes in there in the judicial branch. There is a reporter in charge almost of in every newspaper, understanding they're listening to police dispatches. They're also monitoring the court docket reports. Anybody can do that. It's not a big secret. And so we see a willful neglect on the part of the media not to cover a presidential candidate suing another presidential candidate for not being qualified under the United States Constitution. That's a pretty big deal. That is a very big deal. Why doesn't the media want to cover a very big deal like that? Especially when a presidential candidate, as I was, had sued both Senator McCain and Barack Obama, and kept that up in multiple states of the Union, including California, Utah, New Hampshire, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Nevada. The media also was mostly responsible for the pejorative term of birther. And then they wonder why they are given the pejorative term of fake media, fake news media. And President Donald Trump has taken that out on the line as about as far as any person that's occupied the office of the president. Now, to his big credit, his base mostly came from people who were concerned about the Constitution of the United States being upheld. And Sheriff Joe Arpaio was petitioned by 250 constituents of his when he was the sheriff of Maricopa County, one of the largest counties in the United States of America, as a leading law enforcement person, to investigate the long-form birth certificate, and found that over a 5-year period to be a fabrication using identity theft. Now, that investigation was used by myself as a presidential candidate and submitted as evidence of Barack Obama not being a natural-born citizen to a case that when it first came out it was like March 1st, 2nd, or 3rd of 2012 during a primary, and I was a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party challenging Barack Obama's qualifications. That case went clear to the Georgia Supreme Court and to the United States Supreme Court in 1252-76, Judy versus Obama. And the United States Supreme Court wouldn't hear it. Something that actually constitutes willful neglect of their oath. And basically constitutes deferred prosecution for the quote-unquote elite. Now, they wanted to use racial demagoguery to divide the nation, and that racial demography doesn't go well for minorities at all. Because it pits the majority of identity politics, using identity politics, against minorities. The Constitution of the United States is so important for individual rights. And that's why the government, in most instances, hates the United States Constitution. A pure democracy is where the bully rules, the majority, the popular rules. So if you're an individual and you see a great big mob coming against you in anything, that big mob rules, and your individual rights are basically ruled away. And that happened to me, actually, in a criminal prosecution where I was denied the evidence, and I took that clear to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court basically said, well, you got a case, but not enough people suffer from it for us to take it up. Now, in the interim of equality under the law, women basically didn't acquire their voting rights and were not considered equal to men as a voting person or a voting citizen clear to 1965, 4 months before I was born. I've spent the last 10 years standing